Early October 1982, Logan, the typically quiet county seat of Ohio's Hocking Hills, is shocked by a pair of frightful murders and dismemberments. What follows is a twisting story involving lovers, villains, botched investigations, witchcraft, drugs, a wrongful conviction, and the community's loss of life and innocence. This is Township Falls.
Chapter 6, Dime Novel.
Now the stranger started talking, made it plain to folks around. Was an Arizona Ranger, wouldn't be too long in town. He came there to take an outlaw back alive or maybe dead. Said it didn't matter, he was after Texas Red. After Texas Red. Marty Robbins.
In the last episode, we followed Dale Johnston through the legal system, his time on death row, and his release in 1990. Since the release of that episode, we've heard from some people in the area who recall this tragic event. Several people have reached out in reference to the Hang the Bastard t-shirt and made sure we knew he also wore a shirt pretty much every day that said, "Fry the Bastard." I stand corrected. My source material mentioned the t-shirt. Local sources are wonderful, so please keep getting in touch and telling us what you remember. Also, please allow me to make the plea for photos of Annette Cooper to send to her mother, who has no photos or mementos left, only memories. Contact us on social or via email at townshipfallspodcast@gmail.com. This subject seems to have struck a nerve with a few people who discovered our podcast in the last few weeks. I would like to remind you that this is not a story about Todd and Annette. It never has been, not even when it happened. The story related in this season is about the city of Logan and the events that changed the area forever. Todd, Annette, Dale, the families, the police, all of those people are just characters in this factual story that we have researched for nearly a year. In addition to growing up in the era and the area, additionally, further seasons will explore various tales that wind in and out of Falls Township. Hello and welcome to the Township Falls podcast. My name is Sarah and I'm joined today by my co-host and favorite guy, my husband Adam. Remember in the last episode how we spoke about Dale having the burden of proving he didn't murder Todd and Annette? Well, Dale had always maintained his innocence. He discounted the views of those in Hocking County who believed he was the slayer. "I know the truth," Johnston said. "I know what's in my heart." Meanwhile, in Hocking County, Todd's father wasn't so sure about all of that. In the dispatch, he said 3 learned, educated judges already found him guilty once. "I've got no doubt in my mind when he looks in the mirror, he knows that I know he did it," Schultz said. Schultz acknowledged that the entire ordeal had been terribly hard on his family. He went on to say that his entire family took lie detector tests and passed. But Dale took one and his lawyer wasn't happy, so the results were tossed out. Schultz remarks it seems like this case is always there, in the paper or on the news.
There is no denying that this has all been hard on him. Even as the years passed, from what was reported in the news, the books, essays, and even the TV specials about this case, you can see this was nothing short of hell for these folks. But hear us out here. This case was nothing short of sensational. Those types of comments are what made it all scandalous and sensational. Those types of comments are what kept this case in the news.
There was a bank robbery in a nearby county. The FBI confiscated the .22 caliber rifle that was used in the robbery. Hocking County got a hold of the rifle to test it. Sheriff Jones said that since the murder weapon was never recovered, they checked in on such guns when they could. Hocking County Prosecuting Attorney Charles Gerken announced they were just waiting on some evidence and they would try Dale Johnston for murder again. Sarah remarried before Dale was released, but she always maintained that Dale had not killed Annette. In fact, Sarah always maintained that Dale never inappropriately touched her daughters, nor even behaved inappropriately. We found a quote in an old newspaper from Osinkski. He said that Sarah told him if she even suspected that, she would have killed Dale herself.
Let's think back for a moment. Sarah fired off a shot at Detective Thompson. It is speculated she hit his rear end with the bird shot. Sarah had plans to blow up a building and pick off the people she suspected of killing her daughter. She spent time in a state mental hospital, lost custody of her younger daughter, lost her home, lost her money, lost her job, and lost her land. She had to sell some animals. Sarah hit rock bottom. If she thought for even a second that Dale was behind this tragedy, what would she have to lose by saying so? What would she have had to lose by simply killing Dale in the year that the crime was investigated? There's no doubt in my mind that if Sarah had shot Dale, she would have gone free and been deemed a heroine. But she didn't kill Dale. As the years passed, Dale and Sarah lived their own separate lives. Both remarried to other people. Sarah found comfort in animals and art. Dale worked with his hands and was active in his church. They were both out of sight and out of mind for most in Logan. But there were some who didn't forget about Dale. It would take nearly 15 years for the burden of proof that someone else committed the crime would come to the surface. In fact, if one of the deputies had been given more control during the investigation, maybe this mystery would have been solved long before. If Don and Sandra Schultz hadn't spread gossip all those years before and had allowed the law enforcement officers to just investigate the leads that came their way without creating new leads, maybe none of this legal trouble for Dale would have happened at all.
After the trial of Dale Johnston, the citizens of Falls Township moved on with their lives. No one wanted to talk about the possibility that the murderer was still out there. Well, almost no one. You see, even after all this time has passed, suspicious minds still linger in town. Trick-or-treat still happened in the daylight hours on the Sunday before Halloween. While the years had passed, the terrors of the night were just as strong. A real-life horror movie had already played out once before, and in every good scary movie, the killer returns to seek revenge. It wasn't worth the risk to some. But as I sat writing the material for this podcast, I thought of my own childhood. From maybe 1984 until I was too old to trick-or-treat, my parents always took us to West Logan. Our friends, the Huffines family, lived there. We started at their house, and together all of the kids, my step-siblings, Todd and Amy, and I, would run through that little neighborhood and get enough candy to cause a cavity. I can recall getting tangled up in barbed wire somehow one year, and Roger Monk came to my rescue. So I guess it is safe to say after Dale was locked up, our sense of fear eased a little. We weren't ready to go out at night alone, and we were not ready to trick-or-treat at night, but we tried to forget. In fact, many summer afternoons were spent playing in the Huffines' yard on Homer, really not far at all from where those horrible murders happened. But there were some people thinking about Dale and the crime and how someone needed to be held accountable for what happened and the lives that were lost all those years before. For the most part, life went on in Logan. By this time, the death of Todd and Annette were a whisper in the mind. I think for the most part, people forgot about them, but the name Dale Johnston would ring a bell for decades to come. Now, we can stop for a moment and acknowledge something. For every person in Logan who thought Dale was guilty, there was another person to agree with them right around the corner. I was like everybody else. I had no reason to think otherwise. No one had ever mentioned it as a realistic possibility. You see, I think for quite a few people who lived in Hocking County, we had been conditioned to think that the court system would fail us as individuals and as a community. Many of us had a double whammy with the sense of justice being a fable in the area, as Dale was set free in '90, and then just a few years later, a young man named Doug Six would be shot in the head for no reason, and his killer would spend one night in the county jail before going on to live the rest of his days free. We knew better than to expect justice, but the people in Logan didn't know. They were mistaken. We had been denied justice, as we were accustomed to. We didn't know our justice system in town was setting us up to look like small-minded fools. When you step back and look at this case, everything you think you know was made up to create the perfect suspect. But there was already a suspect underfoot the entire time.
Enter into our story a couple of unsung heroes. Prior to the murders, Rodney Robinson had been a respected sheriff's deputy for Hocking County. Having experience in homicide cases, Robinson had been an asset to the department. However, after a long career, he settled into an easy retirement in the hills. When the murders occurred, Sheriff Jim Jones saw the need to consult with the old school. He personally asked Robinson to come out of retirement to provide his expertise. Robinson would eventually be persuaded by Jones. However, it was a decision that he would soon live to regret, for he saw firsthand the terrible way in which the case was conducted. The mishandling of evidence, too many hands in the cookie jar at the cornfield, that goddamn convenient boot print. This was all too much for the veteran investigator. After about 120 days on the case, he'd had enough of being set up to fail. He retired again.
Officer Jim Powers was a Logan police officer during the time of the tragedy. He had an opinion, one that didn't jive with the narrative told at LPD. Simply put, Powers didn't think Dale Johnston had anything to do with the killings. This was an opinion that he would commiserate with his good friend, the now retired deputy Rodney Robinson. Powers would soon transfer to the sheriff's department as a deputy and eventually become the chief probation officer for the municipal court. He and Robinson would often stew over the old case. Robinson had been disgusted by the lies generated by the likes of Detective Jim Thompson. Robinson had the opportunity to interview both Dale and Sarah before Detective Thompson's interrogation. While his companion officer danced around the subject, asking questions that the Johnsons didn't understand, Robinson wasn't one to waste words or actions. The investigator asked Johnston point blank, "Did you have sex with your daughter?" Robinson left the interview convinced that Johnston was not involved, neither carnally nor homicidally.
Robinson was ignored when he attempted to relate his findings to his superiors. He was further revolted when his summation of the crime scene was ignored. Sheriff Jones had called on Robinson to assist from the get-go. Arriving in the now trampled cornfield, armed with a metal detector, he went to work on the crime scene. He observed no blood through the trails of corn stalks, which led from an outcropping of stone at the river's edge. He surmised that this is where the dismemberments had taken place, although the rain and the rising of the Hocking would have washed the area out. Robinson also discovered shovel marks where the limbs and the heads of the teens had been buried. To Robinson, this indicated that someone had retrieved said tool after having shot them, as bringing a shovel with them would have been impractical. Finally, the opinion that whoever did this was likely local, as they would have had to have been familiar with the terrain and comfortable enough to retrieve a shovel.
His summation fell on deaf ears. Still, Robinson worked the case. It wasn't long before his investigation led him to a local animal petting zoo on Route 664, north of the hospital, called Animal Crackers. The little theme park offered a variety of animals, both domestic and exotic, for visitors to interact with. It was operated by Jill Wolfrey. Robinson was following up on a tip the department had received from Wolfrey, in which one of her employees had been acting concerningly odd as of late. The employee in question, Tex Myers. Interestingly, Myers, having just met Annette at the Nelsonville Parade of the Hills, had brought her to Animal Crackers in an attempt to get her hired as a babysitter. He claimed to have been romancing her, though it was clear to Wolfrey that the interest wasn't mutual. Either way, she wasn't interested in the position, likely only the animals at the petting zoo.
Tex has an agitated demeanor as Robinson catches him off guard whilst cutting meat for the animals. "You Tex? I want to talk to you, son." The deputy's interview with a ruffled Tex left him with suspicions. You'll recall Kevin Tex Myers in our past chapters, specifically him being introduced to Annette during the Parade of the Hills. This was just prior to Annette's horse's erratic behavior, in which it reared crazily during the parade. Remember, Sarah watched bewilderedly as the poor beast played itself out back at her farm on Trowbridge Road. Likewise, this is the same Kevin Myers who Sheriff Jones is quick to dismiss, as he is personally acquainted with him. You may also recall the issue. There are two Kevin Myerses.
So when Deputy Rodney Robinson suggested that Sheriff Jones check out Kevin Tex Meyer as a possible person of interest, Jones, mistakenly thinking Robinson is speaking of his acquaintance Kevin, nixes the idea as his Kevin is definitely not involved, as he comes from a good family. As a result, Tex was never interviewed. In fact, he straight up left town. If you recall, it took about 6 months after the murder trial before anyone even searched the vehicle of Tex. At some point, deputies start getting excited. There was a break in the case. They found a pubic hair of Todd's in Dale's boot. But Robinson himself knew how those boots had been secured. He doubted it was legit. By the time the deputies started talking about how the boot print was a match to Dale Johnston, Robinson was frustrated. He had seen the casting that was made. It was in terrible shape. It was of terrible quality. It all seemed fishy to him, especially when after Dale's boots were confiscated, they suddenly had a fresh and clean print to examine. This becomes the cherry on top of a giant shit sundae. Robinson is done. Many years pass.
Through Boy Scouts, I was introduced to quite a few of the players in the murder case. My patrol would take the Citizenship and the Community Merit Badge off of then Judge Fred Mong, whom I thought resembled Sam the Snowman from Rudolph. Similarly, our district had a yearly first aid meet in which civil servants would judge the various stations set up as scenarios of trauma. This was held in the community unit at the Trinity United Methodist Church, of which my parents were longtime members. Alongside state highway patrolmen, paramedics, and local law enforcement were the likes of Sheriff Jones, Fire Chief Don Schultz, and Policeman Jim Powers, that judged our techniques and efforts. Not long after my Boy Scout adventures, I would meet another character in our story. My wife, Sarah, I was introduced through her brother, Joe, a friend and fellow Dungeons & Dragons player. We've been together ever since.
2006, probation officer Jim Powers is speaking with Jimmy, one of his court-assigned parolees. The topic of the murders pops up in their conversation, specifically Todd Schultz, whom Jimmy knew. Everyone in West Logan thinks Kenny was mixed up with him. You guys ought to take a look at Kenny Linscott. Kenny's name was not a revelation to Powers, as he had heard it in reference to the case before. Jimmy went on to inform Powers that he had lent Linscott, an avid and accomplished hunter, his .22 rifle. According to Jimmy, when the rifle was returned, the barrel was damaged. Strange for an outdoorsman like Kenny. This is not the first time Kenny has been brought up. People in West Logan were suspicious of him all along. Kenny had even been noted lurking around the cornfield when the bodies were discovered.
The name rang a bell with Powers. He had in his caseloads a Judy Linscott. A perusal through her file confirmed that she was the wife of Kenny. The two were no longer together, however. Judy was in a woman's rehabilitation facility for her addiction to drugs. Thanking and dismissing Jimmy, Powers then contacted his unofficial partner and confidant, Rodney Robinson, to see if he'd be up for a road trip to the Rural Women's Recovery Center in Athens, Ohio. First, they had to pay the current coroner, Dr. Cumming, a visit. Cumming wasn't in office at the time of Todd and Annette's death. Ergo, he wasn't keen to open up an old case. He didn't want to examine the reports and evidence to determine if a rifle might have been used instead of a pistol.
Not only was it not his case to reopen, but it was also reported that he felt it was a waste of time. Everyone in town knew Dale Johnson killed those kids and got away with it after only 7 years. Something else to keep in mind is that anything Robinson might have wanted to say, he really couldn't. There'd been a gag order issued in reference to this case in 1983. That gag order also stopped Herman Henry from saying much about the investigation. He had been prohibited from speaking out about this case since 1984, when he spoke out in court about the abusive tactics used by Jim Thompson during Dale's interrogation. In 1990, Henry was still under a gag order. Henry's stand in court to speak out, well, that came at a cost. He had once been in demand to help area law enforcement. What had been 25 calls a month dwindled down to about 3 or so. Henry wanted to get away from the area. Even though he owned a home in Hocking County, he finally was able to sell his place and take a voluntary transfer. "I've been wanting to get out of there for 6 or 7 years," he said. But when asked why, he said, "I'd rather not say." You might not know what a gag order is. It is defined as a judge's order that a case may not be discussed in public. Meanwhile, Tex Meyer had moved several counties north, where his estranged wife was, to Licking County.
Pushing 50 years old, a slim, rough-looking Judy met with Powers and Robinson, who would furiously take down notes during their interview. Powers wasted no time in announcing the intention of their visit: the continuing investigation, as well as the possible tie-in of her husband Kenny to the murders of Annette and Todd. In the conversation, Powers alluded that their findings had the teens' movements traced up until they reached the driveway leading to West Logan. "Well, they was at my house," Judy announced. The two old friends exchanged shocked looks, yet kept their cool. Judy was oblivious to the revelation just dropped in the quarter-of-a-century-old case. They talked with Judy for over 2 hours. When they had finished, they knew why Todd and Annette had visited. But more importantly, they knew who left with them before they were murdered. This is Township Falls.
On the next Township Falls, we will learn all about those sons of bitches that had been roaming around the county, attacking co-eds, stealing and doing drugs. It turns out one of them had actually called the police and asked if the bodies had been found way back in October of '82. Now, isn't that interesting? We have been blown away by the response to our little grassroots podcast. Thank you for subscribing and sharing it with your friends. Thank you to everyone who has told us that our editing skills are improving. We started this project as complete newbies. Thanks for bearing with us as we figure the process out. I would like to take a moment to ask you to keep getting in touch with us. If you have newspaper clippings, memories, or even opinions on this case, we would love to hear them. If you knew Todd and Annette, or any of the players in this story, now is your chance to share with us. We will use as many comments, memories, and stories as we can, supplied by listeners in our final episode. You can call our recorded line at 419-777-1147. We're still looking for photos of Annette Cooper. Her mother has no photos or mementos of her daughter remaining, only the memories. If you knew Annette, please look through your old memories and photos to see what you have. It helps us to reach a wide audience if you share this episode on social media. And please don't forget to leave a 5-star review on Apple or heart the episodes on our website where you can listen to them all. The website is a work in process, and we will be updating it with all the clippings, articles, and photos we have collected soon. Music by Richard Ratvasky and Layman's Terms.